I don't think that there's any direct link from philosophy to painting in the sort of the journey that I took. Academically, I did quite well in university, so the idea of becoming an artist was just sort of not one that you would consider. If you do well in school, then you become a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or something like that. So any expression of interest I hadn't been an artist, my parents were like, absolutely not, very bad idea, don't do it, which for Ireland is 100% true. However, then by quite a circuitous route, I ended up with a photography studio. No natural link from philosophy to photography, but from photography to painting, I think there is. And then as you sort of become more confident in your voice, in what you're making, then you're more comfortable introducing more philosophical ideas into your work. I think that it must have. I mean, the environment that you're in definitely has an impact on the work that you do. But I didn't necessarily go to a place to be inspired. I didn't go to San Francisco to be inspired, or Barcelona, although they are inspiring places. But I think it is inevitable that it does inform what you do. This is I made this, by the way. I made this by hand.
Oh, very cool.
I've probably got more enjoyment out of making it than I should. Maybe I should have been a carpenter. But you can see it's mostly oil paints. There's quite a lot of colours. These are the ones that maybe I use more often. Lots of different types of brushes. And the brushes sort of go from brand new here to slightly used to and then they finally get thrown out. And then at the moment, I'm using a medium. This one happens to be an alkyd medium. And that sort of mitigates the risk of fat overlaying, which is a rule with oil painting, because it's, I work in layers, and so each layer is relatively stable in comparison to the layer above or below, because it's the same medium throughout. Yeah. So the ideas that I get, I put them into the work with the hope that some people might see what I'm putting in, but I think it's beautiful when they put their own stories onto the work, with their own messages, or they see new things in it. I made this very big work with onions in it, and for me it was about the layers in an onion, multi-layered thing. But someone else said, it's a bowl of tears, and I was like, yes, that's exactly what I meant. It is a bowl of tears, and I 100% meant that from the beginning. I call myself a theatrical realist in the hope that that phrase will catch on, and by that I mean it's clearly realistic. You know what you're looking at. I'm not painting a strawberry that looks like a lemon, but that you elevate the subject and you elevate the subject matter into something slightly more than just it. So when I paint people, I like to paint them in sort of slightly unusual stage-like, performance-like settings. When I paint fruit, I want it to be really carefully art-directed with, sort of everything pristine and perfect and so on. So it's not like the way you see it in real life. It's not like a photo. It just happens to be photorealistic, but it isn't photorealism per se. But I have no problem with photorealism, just I don't see myself as one. Sometimes you just moment of inspiration, and that's the title. So we were talking earlier about my favourite title for any work I've ever done is The Impenetrable Solitude of Now. Love the title, and it's been downhill ever since, I think. So I peaked quite early with that title. But sometimes you just get an idea and you're like, oh yeah, that's the way it went. I did a big work with grapes, and I've been just rereading the Iliad. And one of the expressions that they constantly use in that is like across the blind dark sea, the wine dark sea, the wine dark sea. And it sounds quite strange to our ears to think of the sea as, wine coloured or wine dark, but for them it made a lot of sense. So then, because it was all about going off to war, in that I was able to put in pieces to do with war, like little figurines, little toys, celebrating people of war. And this is that idea of sometimes you have to treat it like a job. You just have to go in and get the work done. And that's also the downside of it, is because sometimes I'm here, I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden it's 9 o'clock and I've missed an appointment or a dinner date or whatever. So you have to figure out, how do you balance that just drive to be in the studio, but also sometimes you don't want to be in the studio. How do you make yourself come in when you know you've got a deadline that you're working to, there's a piece that needs to get done? And that idea of deadlines, sort of working towards them. I work on multiple layers of paint, and all of these will eventually have 3. You can see, I think we were saying earlier, one of the grapes here, that one is finished. It's done. That was a commission for a lady in the UK. She just hasn't picked it up yet. Whereas these ones, you can see like it's the underpainting. And when it looks like what it should look like, it's done. But at that same time, all I can do is when I look at something like that is the mistakes that I made. And this is what we were saying is, you need to see the mistakes to get better. You need to have that gap between the way you want it to be and the way that it is. Yes, we pulled it out earlier. This is my wife's wedding present, which has been a little bit damaged and a little bit unfinished. So the flesh tones, aren't finished. I'd say there's still a couple of weeks' work left in it, but it's been sitting in my storage or out getting ready to be finished for almost 5 years. They just keep going. So with my work, you often do see sort of the artificial versus the natural world. And we were talking about a painting or drawing by Craig Roddy, and it's called The Futility of Man versus Nature. And I think that very succinctly encapsulates the idea that we are somehow separate from the natural world, and to juxtapose these perfectly made natural objects, these perfectly made man-made objects, person-made objects versus imperfect things like fruit and grapes and so on. And we seem to get more pleasure out of imperfection than perfection. Handmade objects full of errors, kind of like that's the beauty of them. And then, sort of you see, particularly for me, you see these like really gnarly lemons or weird shaped oranges, and those ones are far more interesting than the sort of perfect, archetypical stereotype Woolworth's orange, and it's perfect and orange, and no interest in it. So imperfection, I think, is where beauty comes from. And so juxtaposing perfect man-made objects versus imperfect natural objects just really highlights that. It has a sort of a magic because it pulls in people from all different spheres of life. Often people that you're going to recognize. Sometimes it's proper famous celebrities. Other sometimes it's people who are prominent in the field, but they're all people who are recognizable and of note. And that pulls all together these disparate groups. So it becomes this sort of hodgepodge melting pot. But more than that, I think it gives a huge amount of exposure to artists who do get into it. So I really, I've been very lucky to be in it. So I really enjoy being part of that. But it's also a great opportunity to reach out to artists. I always paint artists that I admire, and we sort of work together. We make this portrait. I think there's always you're always striving for sort of technical expertise. That's one level of it. Really understanding new materials, knowing how Hansi yellow works versus cadmium yellow versus a yellow ochre, how earth colours dry more quickly than sort of some of the cadmiums and so on, how they interact with each other, how to kind of like work with a limited palette or a big palette. So that's one aspect of it, and then understanding things like glazing and so on. But then also, I think the more you do it and the older you get, a confidence comes with it. And the more confident you become, then the more comfortable you are talking. We were talking about how do you talk about your art, and in my head, it's a translation problem. This is what I've said, and then how do I translate it into English, and becoming more comfortable doing that and understanding that. So that's part of it. So within a narrow field of what I do, I see works like this as vastly different from works like this, but they're not. The realism and they're the same ideas sort of playing around with them. In my head, they're different. So they're experiments, but not that different.
And this is what you're working on?
So this is for Melbourne Art Fair, which maybe happens, maybe doesn't, probably doesn't because of coronavirus and so on. So this will be hopefully a grid of 9 with different colours throughout, and then there'll be a bigger work and some other works, and they all will sort of talk to each other. So we were talking earlier about Andy Warhol, and that came from a friend of mine lending me this camera, which is an old-fashioned Polaroid camera from the 60s. It's the one that he used to take all those portraits of his friends and so on. So this is part of it, which then leads to this, which then leads to the things that have been photographed in there. So you have cherries in there, which you've got in there, and you've got little paper cranes, which, well, like in here and so on. So they all of the works feed into each other, but they'll also stand on their own. So you have like this big punch of colour against these beautiful black and whites and greys, hopefully.